Welcome to the Becoming Noble podcast. My guest today is John Carter, who's another Substacker. He writes at Postcards from Barsoom, which was actually one of the first big Substacks to ever give me any attention or exposure. So I'm eternally indebted to John. Our subject for the day is how John has riffed off the work of a scholar who I have tremendous admiration for, who is Iain McGilchrist. To give a very high level view of who we're talking about before John introduces himself, Iain McGilchrist is an eminent neuroscientist and a psychiatrist who was at All Souls College, Oxford, and before that was at the neuroimaging department at Johns Hopkins in the US. In 2009, he published this remarkable, sprawling book of his life's work, essentially, which develops over hundreds of pages from a biological commentary on hemispheric differences in the brain into what is essentially a masterwork of phenomenology and cultural commentary. John has taken that and ran with it into sort of political commentary that is sort of specialized for our sphere, commentary on political differences as they manifest in the right and the left, technocracy, and what this means for the disenchantment and perhaps the re-enchantment of the world. John, welcome to the show. Please introduce yourself and plug whatever it is you want to plug.
Johann, thank you for having me on. It's an honor, and I'm quite glad that I was able to give you that exposure a couple of years ago. You've really run with that, actually. I've been watching your blog grow, and it's been nice to see you building an audience. So yeah, I mean, Iain McGilchrist, I came across his work. Oh man, for the first time probably 3 years ago, and it was actually on a two-part podcast of Mind Matters, Harrison Cayley and Luke Koch's podcast. They're also on Substack at Political Ponerology, and Luke speaks. And I was just kind of very deeply intrigued by what they had to say about it. So I looked up his talks and listened to them on YouTube, and then bought his two-part magnum opus. His actual magnum opus is The Matter with Things, which is like 1,600 pages long, 2-volume, just insanely detailed work, which sort of goes more into like the nature of consciousness and matter, mind, and it's difficult to really summarize it. But I mean, the core of his work, of course, is in the hemispheric hypothesis, the idea that the two hemispheres of the brain have fundamentally different ways of attending to the world. I mean, McGilchrist's hypothesis is that this arose for evolutionary reasons, that every animal has to solve two simultaneous problems: how to get without being got, how to acquire what you need in the environment without being acquired by other things in the environment that see you as a resource, right? So, you need to find food without being turned into food. And the one form of attention requires that you sort of focus in on the available resources and sort of block everything else out. Only look at what is immediately significant to your immediate goals. The other form requires that you cast your awareness out to the entire world, integrate everything, take it all in, synthesize the entirety of it into one continuous whole that just kind of flows forward without worrying so much about what you understand, whether you understand any of it. It's just, you're just in it imminently. So the left hemisphere does the first and the right hemisphere does the second. And it turns out that there are all sorts of sort of correlates to that ramify into the details of how human consciousness works. And his cultural commentary, I guess, he goes into some detail in this in The Master and His Emissary. He goes into, like, for example, the development of civilizations, kind of waves of development and, I guess, barbarism, you might say, going back to the times of the ancient Greeks, where you have periods where all of the arts and the culture and the mathematics, poetry, everything points towards people's hemispheric consciousness being fairly well integrated, that the left and the right hemispheres, the strengths of both are being utilized. And then that crashes back into these periods where the left hemisphere becomes completely dominant and blocks out all of the insights of the right hemisphere. And during those periods, the arts become flat. You stop seeing new developments in mathematics and science and technology. You have a dark ages, basically. And he, of course, is of the opinion that that's happening now, that a lot of the social pathologies that we're experiencing in this part of modernity, and really throughout most of the 20th century, certainly the second half of it, are entirely consistent with an increasingly dominant left hemisphere consciousness. So, in terms of the re-enchantment of the world, the way it kind of plugs into that, so the enchanted world, in my view, is sort of a world which is alive, which is not dead, which isn't like a machine, but more of an organism or a mind. And it turns out that that is the fundamental way the right hemisphere is sort of instinctively responds to the world as though it is a living thing with intentionality and moods and thoughts and all of that. Whereas the left hemisphere sees the world as an object rather than as a subject, something to be manipulated and grabbed that has no subjectivity of its own. So, in that sense, the re-enchantment of the world is sort of like, how do you turn your right hemisphere back on? How do we get back to that kind of consciousness? Because I mean, that actually is the right hemisphere. This is another of the interesting things in McGilchrist's work. It's classically we hear like, oh, like the left hemisphere is like logical and mathematical and rational, and the right hemisphere is kind of like flighty and creative and emotional and kind of silly, right? I mean, it actually turns out that no, like the right hemisphere is actually the more intelligent of the two hemispheres.
Right. I think that kind of clarification is important to issue early on in this discussion, because I imagine some readers that are somewhat familiar with the literature around psychology and neurophysiology may be thinking, well, hemispheric differences, that was the rage in the 60s, and then it sort of descended into pop psychology, and I don't really
Right,
trust it. It's a bit woo-woo. But one of the
right.
things that McGilchrist is wonderful for is actually redeeming this as a serious field of study. I mean, if you read the book, it's certainly not pop science. I mean, he shows in excruciating, wonderful detail that the right and left hemispheres of the brain are not just a physically different size and shape and construction. They don't just develop at different rates and different periods of a young human being's life, which they do, but he shows just this myriad of studies that, for example, when people have strokes or other localized brain damage, it causes radically differing effects within their
Uh-huh,
cognitive processing and the way they understand and react to the world. When
uh-huh,
their normal function is interrupted based on where it is in the brain, and also, what happens if you sever the physical bridge between the two halves of the brain. People function surprisingly well, but with all these weird inconsistencies that you wouldn't expect. And his fundamental thesis, maybe because you have an amazing ability to just take an idea and run with it, I just want to nail down the absolute fundamentals of his thesis in the audience's mind before we go crazy, which is what we're here to do. His fundamental thesis is that the hemispheric separation of the brain is the result of the need to bring to bear two fundamentally incompatible types of attention on the world at the same time, exactly as you said. So one is narrow, it's focused, it's directed by our needs, and the other is broad, open, and directed towards really the entire world other than ourselves, and indeed to some extent ourselves within the world. To give a kind of toy example of what this looks like in practice to make it sort of appreciable to people, let's say you're a watchmaker or a watch repair expert. A man comes to you with a watch, and that is a social interaction that is contextualized within perhaps a shop. You look at him, you understand what he needs, how valuable the piece is to him. You understand how sensitive it is, how careful you need to be with it, how routine an interaction this is going to be. It's a social context, it's a business context. Then, as you take on the act of actually repairing the watch, you move to a very different kind of attention. It's a narrow and focused, abstract, mechanical, goal-oriented attention in which you're looking at something that you're very familiar with, which is the inner functioning of a watch. You're dissecting it. You understand how each piece relates to another. You understand the order in which they need to be taken out, put back together. You're attempting to achieve this specific objective, which is the repair of this watch in a sequential, systematic, and rules-based function, with this object that you're looking at least temporarily, not as a whole, but as a series of small interlocking parts that interact and affect each other in a predictable fashion. Nevertheless, while you are engaged in this hyper-specific functional task, you are perhaps subconsciously, perhaps sort of pseudo-consciously, nevertheless totally aware of your surroundings. So if there was a sudden shift in temperature in the room, if someone said something close to you with words that were alarming or had alarming connotations, if someone waved at you in the distance, if someone tried to catch your eye, if there was some fundamental shift in the nature of your reality that had nothing to do with this hyper-specialized learned task at hand, your attention would very rapidly and with some context be drawn towards that exception, right? So something unexpected had changed within your environment. And John, maybe you can expand on this, how this fits into the kind of get without getting got framework. But
Well, I think that was a fantastic explanation of it, an excellent metaphor. But I would say to sort of riff on that a little bit. So that's what happens ideally, right? It's like, you're drawn into this task that you're doing, and that task sort of becomes your entire world. You've broken the watch down into parts, and you're focusing on all the little parts and how they fit in together, and you just blocked it everything else. And then someone, you know, yells for help across the street or something because their house is burning down because you live in Los Angeles, and you immediately come out of it and go out and run and help. That's ideally what happens. But if the left hemisphere becomes sort of too dominant, too accustomed to just sort of ignoring the input of the right hemisphere, then maybe that person starts shouting and you don't even notice. Because the left hemisphere is also very good. This is a key part of focused attention, actually. It's very good at editing out aspects of reality which either do not fit the model that it's using or are simply irrelevant to the model. And this is something the right hemisphere doesn't do. The right hemisphere simply experiences reality in all of its immediacy without really applying a model to it. Whereas the left hemisphere does not experience reality at all. It experiences its internal model of reality as being more real than the actual real world. And once you see it that way, you can start to see the symptoms of this and all over our society. We have this very abstract society, this managerial technocracy that sees the world, sees humans as machines, sees society as a machine, and and the people running things seem to be only really aware of the parts of this supposed machine, which isn't even really a machine, that's a model or a left hemisphere sort of it's how the left hemisphere just prefers to see reality. But they only see the things that fit into that. And if there isn't like a spreadsheet cell for category, then it just doesn't exist to them. If the variable is not included in the model, well, then that's not a variable that we have to worry about, right? If it can't be measured, if it can't be quantified, it doesn't exist. This happens just repeatedly.
right, so there's this when man's relationship to his environment and to the context or culture that he's embedded within is in some way upset from the natural order of things, this potential for the pathologies of the left brain mode of understanding and processing and interacting with the world sort of become much more intense. So the the function that the watchmaker is able to bring to bear in his fantastic systematic knowledge and ability to repair the watch doesn't come for free. So there are these sort of like associated pathologies of existing for too long within an entirely left brain mode of existence. One is that the correct function should be the right brain is taking in large amounts of contextual information with the world as it is, as it's unfolding in real time. It identifies that a specialized, discrete, object-oriented task would be better handled by the left brain. It hands off direction, context, understanding necessary to the left brain to execute this kind of subroutine, which then constantly checks back in with the context that is being the real world context, the actual accurate understanding of the broader situation that the right brain is able to provide. And so what you have is this sort of synthesis of two understandings of reality, one of which allows you to be very powerful and effective because it strips out extraneous information, one of which allows you to accurately understand where you are in the world and how the world is developing around you. When that configuration doesn't manifest, when you sort of linger too long or apply incorrectly the left brain methodology, these sort of pathologies start to materialize. So the left brain is dealing only in representations, not in raw things as they actually are. So especially if it's overly familiar with a context, it will have built up a very unassailable model in its sort of processing infrastructure, and it will just disregard any exceptions to that model. It will expect to see certain inputs. Anything that doesn't conform to that, it will just basically ignore. It's blind to absurd outcomes because it's not thinking about context outside its sort of understanding of the world. It's dismissive of important new information. It's over optimistic of the perfection of its model of reality. It will take all new context literally. It will tend to sort of self-reference, creating these feedback loops which resemble mania. And this, it sort of has these kind of schizophrenic tendencies if it's not regularly anchored in reality. And I think that's kind of like the heart of what the last section of his book is about, is our reality is changing in ways that nudge us towards the over-reliance and the overexpression of these pathological modes of processing.
Okay, so you have this loop between the left brain's sort of like focused attention on its model representations of reality. You kind of block out anything that isn't sort of relevant to the model, and then back to the right brain, which sort of touches reality itself directly. And as long as that loop is happening continuously, smoothly, unobstructed, everything is functioning fine. And problem is that it can get easily stuck in the left brain mode, because once you're deep into the left brain mode, which you have to do for certain forms of focused attention, certain kinds of tasks demand it, the left brain doesn't care about anything the right brain has to say. It's like, I'm trying to fix a watch. Why are you bothering me with this extraneous information about a bird singing outside my window? Like, I don't care. Like, there's a watch to fix. And then once you get stuck in that left brain mode of thought, getting out of that is extremely difficult. This gets to the heart of the metaphor that he used for his first book, The Master and His Emissary, where he considers the right brain to be the rightful master, the left brain to be the emissary, the useful tool, but the emissary has a sort of an ego problem, if you will. The emissary imagines that he is really the master and keeps sort of trying to supplant the master and put himself in charge. And the problem is that he isn't actually the master. He doesn't really understand the context that the master understands. And then once he starts trying to act as the master, everything starts falling apart very quickly because, he's not paying attention. He doesn't see the things that aren't included in his representation of reality, he just blocks them out or ignores them. And then the contradictions between the model and reality start to accumulate, which eventually leads to disastrous mistakes. I think looking around, we can see this. We can see the symptoms of this sort of everywhere. So one of the longer essays that I kind of riffed off of McGilchrist's ideas in a political sense, it sort of occurred to me that, like, when we think about the right and the left in political terms, by some happy coincidence, it seems that the political right and the political left actually sort of map quite cleanly to the properties that McGilchrist describes of the right and left hemisphere. It's probably an accident, but you never know. I mean, that might have actually emerged from some kind of, like, subconscious understanding of like, intuition of those differences. So, the left is famously obsessed with its with its systems of thought, its ideologies, these castles in the air that they build. And they're also quite famous for sort of ignoring countervailing information, for suppressing it entirely. The classic example would be, they're wedded to this model of human equality, which doesn't actually match everything we understand about human biodiversity. And the response to that is to ignore it or to suppress it, to try to shame it away. Now, on the other hand, the right is generally much more open to the nature of the world as it is in all sorts of different ways, whether you're talking about uncomfortable scientific truths or you're talking about spiritual matters, even. The right as a sort of social organism is much more concerned with what is true than it is concerned with gaining power politically. Whereas the left is kind of the opposite. The left is very concerned with gaining power politically, manipulating reality using power, but is not at all so concerned with what is true.
It's remarkable that the sort of comparison you've drawn out here basically works at every level. So for example, to the extent, and it's not quite right to superimpose, this is the advantage of right brain thinking, this is the disadvantage of right brain thinking, but to the extent that you can do that, one of the sort of disadvantages, one of the reasons that we're not in a right brain mode of existence all the time, is that right brain patterns of thought are fundamentally receptive rather than interventionist, rather
Yes.
than objective oriented. So they're this incredibly curious, social, bonding, outreaching, but still fundamentally passive mode of engaging with the world. It wants to
Mm-hmm.
understand the world as it is. It's fundamentally comfortable with the world as it is. It doesn't need to abstract away. It doesn't have a clear goal in mind that it is trying to bring into being. And that, I think, you might think about this differently as a non-Christian. As a Christian, one of the things you're taught not to do is to immanentize the eschaton, or trying to sort of make heaven on earth. That is not for this world to be. There's no goal of this life except to act in a way that is noble and virtuous and righteous and in accordance with God's will. On the other hand, a much more sort of secular, materialist, progressivist set of concerns and political ideologies are expressly goal-oriented. They have theorized a end state they want to be in, the sort of communist utopia, or whatever it is, depending on which flavor of ideology you're looking at. And so you have this goal. You therefore, exactly as you say, have a body of theory which is necessary, which translates into praxis, which you need to conduct in order to, and all the extraneous information that gets in the way of that sort of perfect model of, here's the theory, here's the prescribed action, here is the endpoint, get marching, ignore everything else.
Right.
The whole system fits.
You either block that information out, or you develop some kind of circuitous logical web in order to explain it away, which is a way of blocking it out, really. But the imperative is always the maintenance of the model, because the model is ultimately essential to achieving the goal, right? And it's all about the goal. It's very goal oriented. It's very active, and I think and you see this in other ways actually. So you mentioned earlier that one of the characteristic pathologies of the left hemisphere is this kind of like schizo autistic mode of thought. Uh, but it's also interesting to note that McGilchrist, he I don't know if this was in Master and his Emissary, but I know it was in The Matter of Things. And he points out, the right hemisphere could become pathological as well. But its characteristic pathology is actually depression, right? Like when you're in a depressive mode, you're maximally passive. You're acutely aware of all of you're focusing on the shortcomings primarily, your own shortcomings, the obstacles in the world to achieving the goals that you might want to achieve. But depressive people will often have this hyper acute sense of the problems that face them, that becomes paralytic after a while. And I find it interesting that if you look at the sort of mythologies of the left when it goes haywire. It really is this kind of like manic, crazed, like religious possession almost, this kind of frenzy that they go into. And on the right, it's actually, you almost never see that on the right. It's quite the opposite. It's this sort of enemy, right? This sort of like, well, it's all fucked, like what can we do? This kind of Eeyore sort of mentality where, and I'm sure you've seen this all the time in online discourse, where the moment someone says, "Well, hey, maybe we could do this," or if someone says, "Hey, it's this good thing finally happened. We should be happy about that." And your comments will pile up with people being like, well, it wasn't actually a victory, and everything is still screwed, and it's all doomed. You see like the right wing obsession with peak oil or the imminent collapse of society, things like that. Which but there are these sort of depressive symptoms again, which all of this would sort of make sense if the left was actually composed of people who are spending an inordinate amount of time in a sort of left brain mode of thinking, and the right is sort of the opposite. It's people who are maybe a bit more balanced, a bit more biased maybe towards the right brains. And at the same time, like as a result of that, like they understand reality better, but they're more passive. And people were always complaining about how the right is so passive, it can't get off its ass to actually go out and challenge the left. And this may well be intrinsic to the very nature of the right, to which itself goes down to like how human consciousness operates. It might not be a problem that can be solved. It might just be a predicament. And then once you recognize that predicament, you just say, okay, this is the underlying neurology of why this is happening. Can we still find a way towards rebalancing the cognitive architecture of society, to something healthier, right? Because I think if we think, okay, what does victory look like, for our side? It really is this kind of rebalancing rather than like the permanent eradication of the left. I don't think anyone really thinks that's actually possible. It's like you just need to get those idiots under control, kind of thing. Um,
Friend of the pod, Charles Hayward, would disagree, but I'm probably with you
yeah,
on this one.
no, Haywood would absolutely disagree. But I don't know. I don't think that it's ultimately possible to completely destroy the left like that, because if it's coming out of just human architecture, we all have a left hemisphere, right? And to be fair to the left, they do occasionally serve a purpose. I mean, like we like to talk about Chesterton's fence. Yeah, well, sometimes the fence does need to be torn down, right? Like it is good sometimes to go out into the world and to change it in some way. This is a necessary function. The problem becomes when it becomes this sort of manic mechanical process where you're just running around tearing everything down with not really paying attention to the consequences that don't fit into your model, and then disaster results.
Right.
Another way of putting it would be like victory in this looks like the Renaissance. It looks like classical Greece, and in the early the early Roman world. It looks like the Romantic era, right? It looks like a time where you have a flourishing of science and art and beautiful architecture, and just like the world coming alive again and adventure coming back into the world. That is what, to me at least, like that's kind of what victory is, because this is a naturally cyclical thing we're talking about, even down to the level of how the human mind works. For your attention, the locus of your attention is kind of like bouncing back and forth between the two hemispheres. The same is going to be true kind of human history. Like it might be that we have to go into these sort of like left brain dark ages periodically. This is just an unavoidable cadence to the development of the species. We have to go through this.
Yeah.
But since we now understand this neurologically, we can maybe be a little bit more sort of deliberate about it and avoid getting stuck in it for several centuries at a time.
As you say, that the overactive right brain, the over dominant right brain, is characterized with a depression, or the other word he uses is melancholy. And
Yes.
that there's a sort of dense phenomenological discussion that goes on, but at the heart of this is something to do with the fact that the right brain mode of thought, is always searching for connection. It's always reaching out into the world. It's specialized over and above the left brain in social conduct, subtle cues, facial
Mm.
expressions, this kind of thing. So there's a melancholia that attaches to that, but it's also a world that it recognizes is inhabited by unresolvable paradoxes. So
Mm-hmm.
left brain modes of processing are sequential, they're abstract. The center of language in the brain is primarily in the left hemisphere, not entirely.
Yes.
Anything that is to do with the navigation of the sort of mechanics of speech is executed primarily in the left brain. But
Mm-hmm.
importantly, anything that requires metaphor or simile or image or poetry or any other kind of subtle implied emotional resonance as opposed to explicitly stated emotional fact has to be ensconced and sort of supported by right brain processing. And part of the reason for
And
this is
I just want to
yes.
pause. I just want to pause there, actually, and point out that this is another point, another aspect where we actually see this in the political divide, right? So, the characteristic discursive mode of the left are these walls of text that are sort of like densely theoretical, but are usually not that much fun to read. Actually, like they're just kind of very dry, but they're very verbal, right? Whereas on the right, our characteristic mode of discourse, at least in the internet era, has been the meme, this sort of like visual metaphor, which is a much more right brain means of communication. And when a lot of the writers on the right, when they, because we have, I think, some pretty good writers, but the mode of writing is actually like much more sort of like flowing and metaphorical and sort of poetic than you typically will find on the left, where it's just this kind of like dry statement of fact and reification of models and reiteration of principles and just rage, 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 which is very characteristic left hemisphere emotion.
Right. Whereas on the right, we have remember what they took from you. It's over.
Right.
There's this whole set
Yes.
of like melancholic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And the longing thing, actually, I believe McGilchrist kind of contrasts that with desire. It's like the left hemisphere wants something, right? It's like, if you think of it in a romantic sense, like the left hemisphere is lust. It wants to possess a specific thing. Whereas with the right hemisphere, it's sort of much more it's vague, it's like it's not directed at any one thing per se, but there's this kind of inexpressible feeling of you want this connection to something, to everything, and if you express it in a romantic sense, it's like maybe a woman becomes the symbol of that, but she's sort of also the connection to something higher, something divine, something beyond even her. It becomes inexpressible because the left hemisphere's entire purpose is to like connect with everything, whereas the right hemisphere's entire purpose, or the left hemisphere's entire purpose, is to possess one thing.
Right. Left wing heroes tend to be activists or people that have actually achieved things in the world. Whereas, and I might be being overly generous to our side here, but like a typical right wing hero is like Achilles, who's fundamentally a tragic figure and
It's
who's,
true.
yeah. And
It's
like,
true. Yeah.
um,
I mean, like, you get like maximally edgy, right? It's like, who is the most sort of like celebrated right wing figure of the 20th century? I mean, we all know who that is, right? If you don't really want to admit it. Um, and he is actually a very tragic figure. Like, he lost for one thing. His country was destroyed. He broke the world. And he was this like tragic artist, his very romantic character. And it's like, and there is this kind of like deep sort of, it's like, and he was one of history's losers, which like the other side will point out quite happily. Yeah,
It's
it's like this romantic attachment to doomed causes almost, which is, and you had your essay on Northern Courage, I remember a couple of years ago, which I think is like slots into this actually perfectly. Like the ability to stand your ground, to maintain a position, even when you know you're going to lose, even when you know that like doom is inevitable, right? And there's something deeply appealing about that in a weird way, actually, very attractive.
one of the reasons that you get these left-wing walls of text is, as you say, that the left-wing project has become saturated with theory, and it's theory building on theory, and you can't state something new without stating all the theory that led you to that point. So to justify your position, you have to reference everything that came before, and you end up trying to like pack Hegelian metaphysics into a meme or whatever. It becomes preposterous. And a right-wing meme is essentially like, remember reality. It's just a shot
Yes,
of an image, which is like,
right,
oh yeah, that's what
exactly,
reality looks like.
right, exactly,
And
exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
So it doesn't need the wall of text at all. It's just like, a single instantaneous gestalt sort of, and the image often acts as a kind of cynic dose for like, all of the connected context and concepts as well.
the other thing I wanted to discuss, and we're like edging around this topic, but I wanted to get it out there because you had a brilliant essay on it, was how this relates to the desacralization and the resacralization of the world.
Hmm.
One thing that, I mean, just to sort of tee us up, one thing that is characteristic of a left brain versus right brain mode of apprehending the world is the right brain will perceive something and will instantly process it as a whole and react to it, categorize it instinctively, sort of comprehend it as a whole, as a unity, and not as an isolated thing in a artificial snapshot in time, but as a sort of living, changing entity, almost like a platonic form that
As
continues
a as
existing in
a
front of it
as a flow, yeah, like the
as
way
a
that,
flow, like a
yeah,
river.
yeah.
Whereas the left brain mode of apprehending things is much more systematic. So it will isolate different parts of a whole, break them
Hmm.
down, and then start trying to add parts together to understand how together they comprise a sort of system made up of these little parts. So it's much more sort of tiny focused. Maybe McGilchrist does this in his work. I'm like many hundreds of pages in, but I'm not all the way to the end. So you'll be able to call this out. But one thing that I think you did very well was you translated that into our entire mode of belief and discovery of our universe in the process of what we now call science, which has become
Mm.
ever more fragmented into these hyper specialized, hyper autistic tasks, wherein the entire picture, the sort of deeper meaning, how everything holds together, how it flows, why we're here, has been lost in the pursuit of these micro niche additive processes.
Yeah, and you're starting to see the sciences break down actually as a result of that, because it's actually very difficult to maintain, as a human being. It's difficult to maintain your enthusiasm for these, like, you know these tasks that have become so small and hyper specialized that, they do seem meaningless. It's led to a breakdown in communication between the different branches of the sciences, where, frequently even, subfields of the same discipline that are adjacent to each other are mutually incomprehensible. So, information just isn't being transmitted from one part to the next. So, one subfield is still using as a core concept, something which has been discarded as obsolete and simply wrong by another field. They just don't know. And they're just continuing robotically on, basing everything on that. Another field, isn't incorporating a breakthrough that would actually, change their entire way of doing things. And it turns into this kind of Tower of Babel, actually. It ends up breeding cynicism inside the sciences, because, of course, you realize after a while that it's all kind of a game. And it's actually a game which is being played for status inside the academic hierarchy, for grant dollars, for awards, what have you. And it doesn't necessarily matter if if what you publish is true. All that matters is that you publish and you get citations, and then that leads to a certain amount of malfeasance and a large amount of sloppy work, which means that a lot of what enters into the literature is just wrong. And then, of course, simple greed. Once the biopharmaceutical industry gets involved, they see scientific literature as a marketing tool, so they're quite happy to use that to lie, which again pollutes the truth stream. After a while, like you kind of step back and you're like, wait, why are we doing all this? Like, most of this is pointless work. A lot of it's just fucking wrong, and it's not leading us anywhere. It's not doing anything spiritually important for us. The entire purpose of this enterprise in the beginning was ultimately to better understand the mind of God. And then at a certain point, we decided that there is no mind of God because God's dead.
One of the things, the distinctions you make, which I think is a helpful one in your piece, is you separate this kind of data-driven acquisition of knowledge from an older, larger, more encompassing, more dynamic, more perpetual form of knowledge, or at least of sort of bodies of thought, which you call out as mythos, which I think is sort of powerful. So it's the if the current process of science is, you go into some disciplinary specialization, and because your supervisor or the school that you're in specializes in some subfield, you take on some subfield within that, and you do tiny experiments, and you sort of publish a paper which 5 people read. That's like taking a tiny dropper from the stream of knowledge and extracting a single drop and looking at it in a pipette. And we've kind of like done that 10 billion times and just totally lost sight of the river, right? Like where the river is, where it's going, the concept of a flowing static. So these kind of overarching bodies of knowledge have been lost. And it's not even that the forest has been lost for the trees. The forest has been lost for a micro section of a single leaf on a single tree. And the world has sort of lost all significance as a result.
Yes, exactly. I could not have put it better myself. My direct experience is that just a huge number of people engaged in the sciences don't even really care, to be honest. Like, I've known people, finishing the PhD who have only the vaguest understanding of how whatever their project is connects to fields one step over, which they don't know anything about at all. They really are just like hyper specialized in this one project that they've done, and they're utterly incurious about what's outside of that. Like, unless it's directly relevant to the project you're working on, they don't care. And then they spend the rest of their careers kind of deepening and elaborating that one project, again, without really being curious about anything outside of it, which, as you noted before, the left hemisphere is deeply incurious. In fact, curiosity is a function of the right hemisphere. And frankly, I think DEI stuff that's really exploded inside the academy in the last several years. I think one of the driving factors of that is that you have an influx of particularly women who, I think, because women tend to be more people oriented than object oriented, and they go into the hard sciences because women in science is important, and they want to be important. And then they find that doing this sort of abstract mechanical work is actually very unfulfilling to them at a deep level. And to try and they find something more fulfilling, they adopt the religious mission of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then sort of devote themselves to advancing that, within whatever academic sphere they're in, because this is where they actually can find a great deal of meaning. And of course, like that ends up being massively pathological and destructive inside the enterprise of science as a whole, but probably inevitable, because once it became an atheist enterprise, stripped of all higher meaning, nature hates a vacuum, right? Something is going to move in. And of course, this Gersatz religion is a thing that's moved in. I'm sure as a Christian, you would suggest that the way to fix this is to sort of return to God, right? And I would actually largely agree with that. The trick is like how to get people into the mindset like of being open to that in the first place, which you know comes down to, okay, how do you knock them from their left hemisphere mode into their right hemisphere mode, right? Which is in that essay, the re-enchantment of the world, sort of one of my goals there. So sort of implicit in the way I structured it was to sort of place people into that frame of mind. Like you probably noticed that I didn't really give any easy answers by the end of the essay. Like there's that whole thing at the beginning about birth rates and whether you can increase the birth rate by coming up with a fake religion, and I kind of acknowledge the birth rate thing is a massive problem. Kind of say, yeah, fake religion isn't going to do the job, but I never actually say how you would increase the birth rate, or I never really say like how you really fix any of this exactly. It's like I try to sort of imply it more by demonstrating a mode of thought, and then like placing the reader into that
Yeah.
as they go through it. Yeah,
I think
yeah,
the challenge is one of the need for a return to authenticity to ground this entire enterprise. So, McGilchrist makes the point that when your psychological architecture is functioning correctly, you have this kind of right brain apprehension of the world, devoting specialized tasks to the left brain, which checks in with the right brain, that its understanding of reality is in fact reflective of what is actually going on around it. And McGilchrist makes the point that our society, the existence of an individual within a society, and the day-to-day experiences and tasks and processes he's interacting with are across the board artificial now. So that even those
yes,
those moments when you would expect to be regrounding in reality, for example, the kind of religious dimensions of your life, you're in fact not. You're just interacting with the sort of externalization and formalization of left-wing calculated
you're you're
technocratic
you're
systems.
going through the motions of like ritualistic motions of worship, right? Without like any deep meaning behind any of it. Or, another example would be, oh, to reconnect, so you have to go back out into nature. Okay, so you take a few days and you go for a hike and you're like, oh, it's so beautiful, and okay, you've you've checked off the box, and like it's not really that easy though.
It's interesting because you called out the kind of DEI as a form of pseudo religion, which of course it is, but it's also one that's born of a huge body of theory, which
Yes.
has been instrumentalized for expressly political purposes. So
Hmm.
that kind of religious tendency in people's lives actually ends up doubling down and accelerating the kind of left brain return to theory and keeps people abstracted out of reality. And that I think is unfortunately why the Collins's project is doomed to failure. Is that I think, as you said, as others like our mutual friend Dave Green has said, its artificiality is too on the nose, and therefore it doesn't represent that return to authenticity that is necessary to ground people in reality, that is necessary to motivate
Right.
authentic and powerful action.
Right. It's like if you know something is fake, that it's contrived, then it's just not going to be able to have any kind of real impact on you. And this applies in the religious domain. This applies in the romantic domain. It's like you can find a prostitute and pay her $1,000 to pretend to be your girlfriend for a night. And sure, it'll be fun. You'll get laid, sensually, and sure, it'll be a great experience. But deep down, you'll know, she doesn't have any real feelings for you. This is all fake. And so like you're not going to really experience love yourself, right? Or adventure tourism, which is a complete misnomer. Like, okay, yeah, you're going on this voyage, this journey, and you're beholding these epic sights, and you're getting out of your comfort zone and so on. Yeah. But deep down, it's a curated experience that you're being taken on a tour. It's all very safe, you know. And so it actually isn't really an adventure. It doesn't really, wake anything up inside of you. I don't have, unfortunately, like an easy answer to that problem. in our current context, because as you said, everything is so artificial now. Everything is so contrived that escaping from that, even for a moment, is actually very difficult. And it might be actually that like the key is simply really is like that yearning, that longing, that having at the back of your mind that this is what you're trying to connect with. That as long as you keep coming back to that, maybe these things present themselves to you in an unexpected way. And I guess they probably have to be unexpected. If you're open to it, it will eventually come. Now, ultimately, I think this is really one of the key things, actually, with McGilchrist, is that what's important isn't where you are. What's important is who you are and what you see, like how you are attending to reality around you, to the people and your environment and everything. It's that internal quality, which is really the determinative aspect of your experience, not so much the actual specific place that you find yourself.
Yeah. Maybe I'll do something very obnoxious and just quote from him directly for a minute, because he has this brilliant passage which I think sums up the problem very well. He says, "Today, all the available sources of intuitive life, the natural world, cultural tradition, the body, religion, and art, have been so conceptualized, devitalized, and deconstructed, ironized by self-consciousness, explicitness, and the systems and theories used to analyze them, that their power to help us see intuitively beyond the hermetic world that the left hemisphere has set up has been largely drained from them. For many, TV screens and computers supplant direct face-to-face experience of reality. The cerebral and the abstract, for example, management and its systems, have become more highly valued than the hands-on task that management exists to serve, with the odd effect that the higher you rise in your craft, skill, or profession, the more you will be removed from its performance in order to manage it. A century ago, the physical environment was for most of humanity that of the natural world, with its rhythms and cycles, its organic, ever-growing and ever-changing interdependent life, a world to which it seemed intuitively obvious that we belong. Now it has been replaced for many by an unyielding, inert, confrontational environment of non-living surfaces, straight lines, concrete masses, and largely generic shapes, which are widely experienced as alienating. The result is that the left hemisphere's world has become externalized, so that when the counterbalancing tendency of the right hemisphere to check with the real world of experience is brought into play, it is already subverted. The world out there is already colonized by the left hemisphere's vision, end quote. But I think the reason I quoted that at length was not just because I think it's a brilliant passage, but he calls out the original sources of authenticity in the intuitive life, which are the natural world, cultural tradition, the body, religion, and art. And I think probably a deliberate return to authenticity in each of those domains is something that implicitly all of us, I sense, in our sphere have been striving towards.
Are trying to achieve. You're absolutely correct. The danger whenever you sort of explain something like that, right? It's I can just see some kind of like management guru puke, sort of like listening to that and sort of just like, writing down a checklist, like, okay, so I need my employees I want them to be spiritually healthy and have their right brains activated because this will actually optimize their productivity on the job. So, okay, art. Okay, so I'll put some art to the office. Okay, nature. All right, so there are lots of plants, potted plants in the office and regular employee retreats to the backwoods. Okay, religion. Oh, okay. Maybe we'll organize a trip to mass. We'll all go to mass every Sunday or something, And it's just this like checklist, right? But none of that would achieve the aim, actually, because it actually misses the fundamental point of it. Is that you have to. And the point is this kind of openness, the state of openness that you want to sort of maintain. The rest of these are sort of expressions of that. The other thing that I would say, so in that quote, he emphasizes how, in particularly our urban environments, we are surrounded by the externalized vision of the left hemisphere in all of its manifestations. And this is absolutely correct. Maybe the thing we want to try to imagine doing is what would it look like if we externalized the vision of the right hemisphere? And could we do that using the tools that we have at hand now? And I suspect we could. Public spaces with beautiful representational art that has been generated at scale using 3D milling technology, for example. As I don't know, one example of that. I don't think that it has to be the case that we sort of go to we abandon technology and go to live in the forest or something. If that is the only way to do it, then ugh, a lot of people are going to have to die, unfortunately. Because like the world can only support so many hunter gatherers, and I would hate to imagine that like this entire enterprise of civilization that we've been engaged in for the last several thousand years has all been just one giant mistake, one giant blind alley. Like I would much prefer that it is leading somewhere good, or at least has good stops along the way. And then if I look over the last several thousand years, you can see like these high points of civilization, like in Greece and Rome in the Renaissance, where it was intensely technological, intensely scientific, but at the same time, it was this flowering of the human spirit above all else, which would not really have been possible, I think, in a pure state of nature.
That sounds like a brilliant place to end. John Carter, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Do you want to shout out where people can find you?
Yeah, you can find me, of course, on Substack at postcards from Barsoom, barsoom.substack.com. And I am also on Twitter at Martian Wordlord. It's weird, like the old Anglo-Saxon weird, WYRD, where I'm thrilled to announce that my follower count finally eclipsed my subscriber count on Substack like a month or so ago. It was a nice little milestone.
I'm afraid that disqualifies you as a serious thinker. All serious thinkers.
It's funny you say that because like spending more time on Twitter, like I actually feel dumber on Twitter, like by like a standard deviation. It is bad for the discourse. Twitter is cancer.
Truly. All right. Thank you so much, man. This was really fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed this. Thanks a lot for having me on.
To unlock premium episodes, as well as over 100 essays and other benefits, go to becomingnoble.substack.com/audio for an exclusive 10% discount for podcast listeners. That's becomingnoble.substack.com/audio. Enjoy.